We're looking at Halacha Zion in the first parak of Talmud Torah, which addresses the issue of paying for tuition. We touched on this in the past, back on Halacha Beis, in differentiating between the father's obligation and somebody else's obligation. The father has to pay tuition for his son. The problem with paying tuition for Torah study is a problem which is addressed here in Halacha Zion by the Rambam. And I'll just, pulling out three words out of context, so to speak, in Halacha Zion. Asur lelamda b'schar. We're going to derive from a pasuk, says the Rambam, that you're not allowed to teach Torah and get paid for it. And that seems to undermine everything we've been assuming about the obligation of a father to pay tuition for his son. Now, theoretically, you could say that the Melamed who's taking a salary is being paid for something else, not for Torah study. He's just a babysitter, or maybe he's in charge of the security of the children, supervising them, and so forth and so on. That's famously known in the Torah world, halacha world, as schar tircha. He's not being paid really for Torah study. The Rambam doesn't even hint at that concept, but rather seems to be attacking this issue head on under the assumption that you can receive payment. The Rambam is very complicated because he tells us that there are two different minhagim, two different customs. There are those who are machmir and refuse to allow a melamed to be paid. There are those who have a minhag lekula and allow the melamed to be paid. The Rambam is even more complicated because he differentiates between Torah shebechsav and Torah shebal peh. Now, I'm sort of at a funny kind of crossroads. I don't know which way to go here. We can read through the Rambam line by line and raise all the issues that have to be raised when we try to figure out what the Rambam is saying. Or we can zoom in and focus our attention on one or two lines out of this very long, complicated halacha Zion. So I think the way I want to go today, after wishing everyone a Chodesh Tov, is to focus on, sort of like box off a few lines in the Rambam here in Halacha Zion, leaving the entire halacha to be analyzed from beginning to end, kiseder, for another occasion. And if that can't be next week, then maybe we'll pick it up in El. We'll decide as we go along what the schedule is going to be. So which lines do I want to focus your attention on in this halacha Zion? First of all, the Rambam writes, with regard to those places that allow a melamed to be paid, that minhag, no sein lo scharo, the father will pay the salary of the melamed, ad sheyikra Torah shebechsav kula. Now, in the past, we've discussed at great length the word kula, and you may recall that we derived from the word kula in the Rambam that included in the father's obligation is neviim and ksuvim, not just chamisha chamushay Torah. And in the past, we have mentioned that although the Rambam seems to be focused on schar, on the obligation of the father to pay tuition, and that's quite clear from the context of the Rambam, yet the Kesef Mishnah, as we discussed at great length last week, goes out on a limb and assumes that the Rambam is defining the scope of the obligation of the father, not just for payment and tuition, but even as far as the basic fundamental issue, what does the father have to guarantee? What does he have to teach his son, whether it be face to face or whether it be by hiring a malamed? And the Kesef Mishnah derives a conclusion, which we're not exactly sure where he saw it in the Rambam, that when the Rambam writes, Chayav Lalamdo, I'm going to skip a word deliberately, Ad Sheyikra Torah Shebechsav Kula, the Rambam is telling me that the hekev, that the scope of the father's obligation is just Torah Shebechsav, Kol Tanakh. And even bechinam, even on a face-to-face level where the father doesn't have to put his hands into his pocket or write a check and empty his bank account to pay tuition, even so, the father is exempt from teaching his son anything beyond Torah Shebechsav. And if you recall, we spent quite a bit of time on this last week. How could that be? After all, the Gemara says that if your son is mechudad, shmaitita, tfei, if he's very sharp, then you will sit and support him and send him off to learn. Now, if he's sharp, we're not talking about Torah Shebechsav and Mikra. Obviously, we're talking about Havana and Torah Shebal Peh. And we try to defend the Kesef Mishnah by saying that that Gemara is talking about a different kind of mitzvah, the mitzvah of tzedakah. And if there's a mitzvah to give physical sustenance to the poor, then how much more so to teach him Torah and bring him to Chayei Olam Haba. So that was last week's discussion. This week, I want to focus our attention on the following words in the Rambam. And again, we're fast forwarding about 5 lines in the Rambam, depending upon which print you have. And he says, Lo matza mishi elamdo mechina. The father could not find anyone who's willing to teach his son bechinam. And then the Rambam says, Yilmad b'schar. Now keep in mind, if the subject of this Rambam is the father's obligation to pay tuition for his son's Torah education, then the Rambam should have said, Yilamdo b'schar. Teach him b'schar, meaning teach your son. The word Yilamod, Yilmad meaning without the extra vav, seems to be referring to the person himself, namely the father. Now, if it's referring to the father, who's obligated to study Torah, or if you want to put it in fancy Rambam language, l'lamed es atzmo, he has to teach himself Torah, and he's not capable of doing so, therefore he hires a malamed. How would the halacha allow hiring a malamed if you're not allowed to hire a malamed? Meaning, if the malamed is working for a salary, then the Rambam has just finished telling us that asur l'lamda b'schar. And if you'll argue, maybe the Rambam here is talking about Torah Shebechsav, that's very difficult because the person's obligation to himself under Yilmad certainly includes Torah Shebal Peh as well. In fact, I would even say that it's understood that the person was taught Torah Shebechsav, and now he's hiring someone to study Torah Shebal Peh, but the Rambam has just finished telling us that you're not allowed to be paid for Torah Shebal Peh. And the two minhagim that the Rambam refers to in the Reisha, that's as far as Torah Shebechsav is concerned. Aval Torah Shebal Peh, says the Rambam, Osur l'lamdo b'schar. I read that for the third time. How then could the Rambam go ahead and say that if you couldn't find anyone who's willing to teach you bechinam, which is a problem because you want to study Torah Shebal Peh, and the Torah doesn't allow you to pay for that, says the Rambam, Yelamed b'schar. And the Rambam quotes a pasuk in Mishlei, Shenemar emes knei. Buy the truth. The truth here is a reference, an allusion to the Torah. Buy it. Pay for it. Now, I understand that from that pasuk emes knei, you could derive the conclusion that the person who needs to study Torah and couldn't find a culprit who would be willing to teach him Torah for free, he's got to be emes knei. He's got to buy the Torah. He's got to pay for it. But what I don't understand is what about the Melamed, who's teaching Torah Shebal Peh and getting paid for it, which the Rambam in the previous line has established that he's not allowed to do. He's not allowed to take money for teaching Torah. So what I'd like you to do, if you can, is to open up the pages that David was kind enough to circulate, if you'll see it in your email. And in the first paragraph, after quoting the Kesef Mishnah, how could it be that the Rambam says you have to hire a Melamed for Torah Shebal Peh if we're talking about the father vis-a-vis his son? The Kesef Mishnah has already established that you, as a father, have no obligation to teach your son Torah Shebal Peh. Certainly not B'schar and not even Bechino. Elamai, according to Kesef Mishnah, we're going to have to take a different girsa in the Rambam, and I'm going to call upon, if you don't mind, Yudi, to try to clarify the exact girsa. Maybe go back to the original Rambam where he gave his haskama to the Ksav Yad. And the alternative reading of the Rambam is that the Rambam is not talking about the father's obligation to teach his son. It's impossible because according to Kesef Mishnah, you can't learn like that. But rather, we're talking about a person who has to teach himself. The kavanas haRambam l'kvoa chovas ha'odam l'lamed es atzmo afilu b'schar. And therefore, instead of l'lamdo, we're going to have the word l'lamed, or lilmod, if you will, but not l'lamdo meaning to teach him. Again, it's a bit choppy in the Rambam, even if I take this girsa, because it's like pasach bechitin v'siyem b'saorim. I mean, the Rambam opens up in Halacha Zayin describing and addressing the extent to which the father is obligated to his son, and then all of a sudden the Rambam turns around, and once having mentioned the issue of getting paid to teach Torah Shebal Peh, he turns around the Rambam, he says, well, what about me? I have to learn Torah, and I can't find anyone to teach me Torah bechinam, so therefore emes knei, pay for it. But we could survive that. We could say Resha of Halacha Zayin Bechovas Ha'av Klape Beno, Seifa Bechovas Ha'odom Klape Atzmo, his own personal obligation to study the Torah, in this case Torah Shebal Peh. And the Rambam in the Seifa is quoting Emes Knei to prove that your obligation is to guarantee that you are taught Torah. Emes Knei. If you have to buy it, buy it. You have to pay for it, pay for it. But in the next paragraph, I say, okay, maybe we've solved some problems. We've defended the Kesef Mishnah with this new alternative Girsa text of the Rambam by subtracting one Vav from the word Yalam Do. But we've opened up a can of worms, so to speak, because now we have a more fundamental problem. How could you possibly pay a malamed to teach yourself Torah Shebal Peh when you have just established that you're not allowed to teach Torah Shebal Peh b'schar? That payment and teaching Torah Shebal Peh are mutually exclusive. So to kick it off, and again, you gentlemen will have to be the jury. I'm working on this very hard. I came up with the following chakira. You all know what a yeshivish chakira is like. Is it A or is it B? This business about not being paid for Torah Shebal Peh, what is it? Does it mean that the malamed who teaches and gets paid has violated an avera? It's what you call a maisa isur. Or no? There's no avera here, but he forfeits a kiyum mitzvah. Like, what shall I say? If there's a mitzvah of sukkah, to live in a sukkah, there are two possibilities. One possibility is that I'm out of the sukkah, but I'm not doing anything particular out of the sukkah. So I lost the opportunity to fulfill a mitzvah, and then it could be an avera if I eat outside the sukkah. Now, again, this is a long discussion, not for now. I don't want to get off on a tangent to sukkah. The Minchas Chinuch assumes that if you eat a meal outside the sukkah on sukkahs, you violate an avera. And honestly, I can't accept that, but that's the Minchas Chinuch. He doesn't need my haskam. So we always differentiate between two scenarios, two situations. One situation is where you do an avera, and in other situations where you forfeit a mitzvah. So what I'd like to suggest is, and we'll see if it's a stretch in the language of the Rambam to push this into the Rambam, that getting paid for teaching Torah Shebal Peh is not an avera, it's not a maisa isur, but rather it's a forfeit of a mitzvah saseh. And by teaching and getting paid, you now give over or give up on your mitzvah. You will not get brownie points for teaching Torah and getting paid. But there's no avera here. And what do I want to gain by saying that there's no avera here? I want to suggest that if you're not involved in an avera, you might be able to get paid for Torah if that's the only way that so-and-so could learn Torah. Meaning, for the benefit of his mitzvah, and he can't find anyone who's willing to teach him bechinam for free, I will forfeit my mitzvah for the sake of his mitzvah. Now watch this. We have a principle in halacha. This is in Shabbos Daf Daled, in a case where that Reuven put a dough into the oven on Shabbos, and Shimon wants to take it out of the oven. We have a principle called Ein Adam Chote kidei lezakos es chavera. So Reuven is not allowed to do an avera simply to prevent Shimon from doing an avera. And in the history of halachic morality, you have to really study this very well. It's a sugya unto itself. Why isn't it morally acceptable for me to give up on my avera for the sake of saving him of his avera? But without going into that, clearly, if I were to teach you Torah, because you can't find anyone to teach you bechinam, and I would say, all right, you got to pay me, because I'm giving up a job, I'm going to starve myself and my family, so pay me for it. I can't do an avera for the sake of your Torah. But if we say that there's no avera in teaching Torah and getting paid for it, just that I'm forfeiting an essay, then it could be possible, theoretically, that I could forfeit my mitzvah for the sake of your Torah. If, let's say, imagine that you have no one else to teach you Torah, I'm the only one available, but I need to get paid. But if I get paid, I forfeit my mitzvah of Talmud Torah, but maybe it's for the greater good of your mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Because your mitzvah of Talmud Torah is, let's say, more desperate than mine. Or alternatively, when I teach you Torah, I'll also be involved in the study of Torah. Joe?
I mean, we have with regards to halachas of Shabbos and somebody's ill, right? That it's dechuya. So, but I don't see this as being the same kind of thing. How are you?
Well, again, you're talking about a case which is called pikuach nefesh. I would not violate the Shabbos unless there's pikuach nefesh. I'm not talking about pikuach nefesh.
Exactly.
I'm talking about doing an avera of getting paid for Torah for the sake of his Torah. I can't do that. I'm not allowed to do an avera for the sake of sparing him. I have to worry about my own avera. The Torah says don't do it, don't do it. But I'm suggesting another possibility here, that the Torah doesn't say that if you take money for teaching Torah, you violate an avera. No, that's not what the Torah is saying. The Torah is saying that you have an obligation to teach Torah without getting paid. If you can't do so, okay, onus rachmana patre, and you're going to get paid and you're going to forfeit the mitzvah. But it's not like you did an avera. So perhaps I could forfeit my mitzvah for the greater good of your studying Torah. But let me go even a step further. Let's assume there's no avera and maisa isur in teaching Torah and getting paid for it. I'm only forfeiting my mitzvah haseh. Am I really forfeiting my mitzvah haseh? Well, let's think about the mitzvah of teaching Torah. What is the mitzvah of teaching Torah? I'm going to use a little bit of brisker jargon here. It's what we call the chovas gavra. The Torah says, "V'shinantam levanecha," you have to teach Torah. But there's another dimension to the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Putting the chovas gavra on the side for a moment, there's an obligation vis-a-vis the Torah itself. The Torah has to be studied. The Torah and its knowledge has to be disseminated. That's my obligation vis-a-vis the chefts of the Torah. What should I say? It's like, if you ever heard of Shmiras HaMikdash, right? The Leviim have to circle, they have to circle around the Mikdash to protect the Mikdash. That's a kiyum in the Mikdash. It's an obligation not only on the Gavra of the Levi, but it's also generated by the Mikdash itself. The Mikdash is crying out, I need Shmirah. And in Talmud Torah, perhaps there are two dimensions to the study of Torah. There's to the teaching of Torah, excuse me. One dimension is I have to teach Torah. I'm a chacham. I know Torah. I have to teach Torah. And then there's another dimension of the chefta shel Torah has to be studied. So when we say that you're not allowed to take money for teaching Torah Sheba'al Peh, we don't mean to say that you violated an Isur. We're willing to say that you forfeit a mitzvah, but which mitzvah? You may be forfeiting one mitzvah, but achieving another mitzvah. You're not giving up on the mitzvah entirely when you teach Torah Sheba'al Peh and get paid. You're giving up on one kiyum, on one dimension of the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, namely the Chovas Gavra. Chovas Gavra depends upon the fact that you're teaching for free. But as far as the Chefta Shel Torah is concerned, here we look at the student, at the recipient, and we ask ourselves, did he achieve knowledge of Torah? And if the answer is yes, the fact that you got paid to supply him with the knowledge of Torah does not undermine your mitzvah vis-a-vis the Torah of disseminating Torah knowledge. So that although you forfeit the Gavra of Talmud Torah v'shinat levanecha, but as far as the Chefta Shel Torah is concerned, you, at the end of the day, taught Torah to so-and-so. He gained Torah knowledge, and by his achieving Torah knowledge, you have facilitated a kiyum in the Chefta Shel Torah of, as we said before, disseminating Torah knowledge. So now, maybe the Rambam can be understood in an entirely different perspective. And again, you're the jury. You have to decide if you go for this or you don't. What I'm suggesting is two chidushim. Chiddush number one is that when you teach Torah Sheba'al Peh and get paid for it, you are not violating an Isur. And there would be no justification to do so for the sake of his Torah, because ein adam chote kedei sheyizkeh chavera. But rather you're forfeiting a mitzvah aseh. That's the first chiddush. Now I want to be mechadish a second chiddush, that even as far as forfeiting your aseh, you're only forfeiting half of the aseh, meaning one dimension of a two-dimensional mitzvah. The mitzvah of teaching Torah is two-dimensional. It's the Gavra has to teach, and it's the Chefza that has to be taught. And the Chefza has to be taught should be understood from the perspective of the recipient of Torah, who is now being pumped up with Torah study and Torah knowledge. So that even though you may be forfeiting your kiyum hagavra to teach Torah because you took money for that, but nevertheless you still achieve a kiyum vis-a-vis the Chefta Shel Torah, because Ploni Almoni has now understood the Torah and achieved Torah knowledge based on what you taught him. And now the Rambam is saying that if the recipient, in fancy Hebrew, is called the mislamed, if the mislamed cannot find anyone to teach him Torah bechinam for free, then emes knei, he's got to find someone to teach him and get paid. And the person who's teaching him and get paid, although he forfeits his kiyum gavra, nevertheless he does have a kiyum mitzvah. And since he has a kiyum mitzvah, he will sacrifice his chovas gavra and kiyum gavra for the sake of the recipient of Islamed, who now has a double kiyum. He's got a full-fledged kiyum of Talmud Torah. And he has now fulfilled his obligation of emes knei, and he bought the Torah knowledge.
And just the word, the term sacrifice, I don't think he's not Mekayim. I don't know if you.
No, what I'm suggesting is, Joe. Again, it's up to you if you want to accept it. It's pretty way out. What I'm suggesting is he's sacrificing only one dimension of the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. And if that be the case, he still has a kiyum of Talmud Torah. He has not violated an Isur, so he doesn't get petch. He will not be punished for it. You can only say that he's denying himself the brownie points of a kiyum hagavra, but at the same time, he will be rewarded because so-and-so now has Torah knowledge. And that's your obligation to make sure that so-and-so has Torah knowledge. And for the sake of that person who couldn't find any volunteer to teach him Torah b'chinam, you're allowed to teach him Torah b'schar. That's the Rambam.
I have a question.
Please, David.
Okay, so in a regular case, let's say some other case where a person makes a profession out of teaching Gemara to children or adults, whatever. So you can say, and even in that case, they can't learn by anybody else, and so he gets half a mitzvah, not the whole thing. So like to say that's us, I don't know where it's us here, but whatever it is, it's not advisable, shall we say. You get paid for teaching Torah Shabbat Peh. You could say, well, maybe it's chatil, but I still get a mitzvah anyway. Does anybody actually say that?
Right, but I'm going a step further than that, David. I'm saying not only does he get a mitzvah anyway,
Right.
but it justifies in a situation where so-and-so could not find anyone on the face of the earth who would be willing to teach him Torah b'chinam. Go ahead and teach him b'schar.
I was assuming that because Bisman is, I mean, generally speaking, other than people who work at like Yeshiva Torah, one of those places, you're going to pay for tuition, quite simply. You know, you pay for yeshiva, you pay for elementary school, whatever it is. So all these people are getting half a mitzvah, basically, according to what you're saying.
Right. Again, you could always argue without the Rambam, meaning leave the Rambam on the side, and then the answer to your question would be schar tircha, you're a babysitter,
right?
Or maybe you're getting paid for
preparation time.
Yeah, for the fact that you could have had a job and so forth and so on.
Yeah. You're right.
My experience, by the way, in teaching Torah and getting paid for it, is that they don't pay me a fraction of what I could have made in a different field. I mean, I'm not saying I would be great at real estate. I'm not saying, although I don't know, but
or medicine, right?
Right.
Yeah, you're right.
But,
I mean,
my father wanted me to go for a PhD in philosophy. So I made a deal with him. I said, you know what? I'll go for a master's degree in philosophy. So that I could dedicate my time to Torah study. Had I gone for a PhD, I had a professor in graduate school by the name of Dr. Jacob Landinsky. May he rest in peace. You can look him up on Google. He's been quoted numerous times on the Supreme Court.
Really? Okay.
When I first saw him in the secular university called the New School for Social Research, I thought he was a meshulach who came into the wrong building. And then I remember asking him once where he sends his kids to school. He says he sends them to the Gerach Cheder. His brother-in-law, you may have heard of. His name is Rabbi Meiselman.
Yeah, of course.
Has a yeshiva called Tomo.
Yeah. I've heard of him.
So I took Jacob Landinsky for every course that he was offering. He was brilliant. He's not alive anymore. And one time he was in a car with my father. They were going to a funeral of a balabas of my father's shul, who was a professor of constitutional law, which was Dr. Landinsky's spets. And Landinsky turns to my father and he says to my father, I would sponsor your son for a PhD program. He would have to give up 1 year for course study. And the next year he could go to Rav Soloveitchik's class. He has to study German. And in 2 years, he'll have a PhD. It was a very attractive offer. Again, how did I get Landinsky to like me so much? Because when he taught constitutional law, I knew exactly the mind of a Lamdan and which issues in constitutional law were uppermost in his mind. So before the final, I locked myself up in a library, and for weeks I studied what's called federalism, which is a question of states' rights versus federal rights. I don't know if does Canada have a constitution?
We have that here too, but not quite the same way we have it.
Yeah. So anyway, on the exam, sure enough, he asked about federalism. He writes me back when he gives me back the exam, you are machadesh chidushim, he writes, that I never thought of. And this is a guy who is top in the field. So anyway, I got in on his better half, and my father was very attracted to this offer, that I could get a PhD. Again, I'm not saying you get, you make $1 million from teaching philosophy in university, but certainly more than what they paid me as a Rebbe in yeshiva. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Okay, Rabbi, so how are we doing on the clock? Because I want to get to the punchline of today's shir. Do we have another few minutes?
Yeah.
Okay.
I just don't understand if he's how can you say like bold faced Torah Shabbat Peh Osur Lalamda B'Schar?
Right. I hinted at that, Bobby, and you're 100% right. I think what he means by Osur Lalamda B'Schar, but keep in mind that's before he gets to the scenario where no one is willing to teach me Torah B'Chinam. Osur means bitul aseh. Like, for example, let's say you have a lulav in your hand on Sukkot, and instead of shaking the lulav, let's call it that, just to use he takes the lulav and he rips it to shreds. Did he do an avera?
No.
He didn't do an avera, but also lasos can. You're not allowed to do that. So the Rambam is telling you that you're not allowed to get paid for Torah Sheba'al Peh, because by teaching Torah Sheba'al Peh, you forfeit an essay, and therefore, by taking the money actively and pocketing it, you are, so to speak, in violation of an Isur, meaning you're not allowed to do it because you're forfeiting the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Any event, this is the issue that we have to deal with, because the Rambam is saying that you can teach Torah and get paid for it if this fellow has no one to teach him Torah b'china. And then you get into the whole problem of ein omrim lo li'adam sheyechta b'shvil sheyizkeh chaver. Anyway, but Rabosa, I want to push ahead here, because I have a little bit of an agenda here in the way I want to read the Rambam. And I'd like you to focus your attention and see if you could buy into my thesis. And honestly, if what I'm about to tell you is correct, then I think it's I don't want to use too much hyperboles here because I'm talking about myself, but I think it's the most brilliant chiddush I have in the whole of Hilchos Talmud Torah. And it might be, if this is what I'm going to tell you now is correct, then it might justify this whole project that I'm involved in to try to publish on Hilchos Talmud Torah in the Rambam. Let's go back to the Rambam and read it carefully. Now, as we read the Rambam, try to listen to the words of the Rambam, his choice of words, and also to the length. The Rambam is absolutely stupendous at brevity. Never has an extra word. So listen carefully. Avol Torah Sheba'al Peh osur l'lamdo b'schar, shenemar. And the Rambam quotes a pasuk, which we're going to read very shortly in the Torah. Re'ei limadeti eschem chukim u'mishpatim kasher tzivani Hashem v'gomer. Watch this. Ma ani b'chinam lomadeti af atem lemadatem b'chinam mimeni. V'chein kishetelamdu ledoros lamdu b'chinam kmo shelamadtem mimeni. Sound a little bit long-winded? Let's try to abbreviate the Rambam in a shorter language, and based on that to ask, why was the Rambam so wordy for what seems to be unnecessary? The Rambam could have written the following. Shenema re'eh limadati eschem chukim mishpatim, etc., the pasuk. Ma ani shakadosh baruch hu limedosi b'chinam v'af ani limadati oschem b'chinam. Period. Watch what's going on here. If not for the Rambam, I would have said that the emphasis here is on teaching Torah. God didn't get paid for teaching Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't get paid for teaching Torah. You don't get paid for teaching Torah. But that's not what the Rambam says. The Rambam says, Moshe Rabbeinu says, I didn't pay for the study of Torah. Right? Read it again. Ma ani b'chinam lamadati. Lamadati means I studied Torah, meaning at the feet of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Eibishter, right? I didn't pay for it. I got taught free of charge, gratis. Afatem, now it's time for you to study Torah, and Moshe Rabbeinu Kibul Torah Mesidim V'Sorah, etc. Lemadatem b'china. You studied Torah gratis. You didn't pay for my salary. What's happening here in the Rambam, I believe, and once again, I'm trying to convince you of this because I'm extremely emotionally involved in this, is that the Rambam is not emphasizing your teaching of Torah, but rather emphasizing being taught Torah. I, Moshe, was taught Torah b'chinam. You, Klal Yisrael, were taught by me Torah b'chinam. Is therefore the student of Torah studies Torah b'chinam. Now, let's add another, just a technical point over here in the methodology of understanding halacha. It seems from the Rambam that I need a pasuk to teach me that a person has to teach Torah b'chinam. I'm talking about Torah Sheba'al Peh. Whenever you derive halacha from a pasuk, what has to enter into your mind? What question do you have to ask? What would have been if not for the pasuk? If not for the pasuk, then the assumption would be that one could get paid for teaching Torah. If I didn't have the pasuk with this very complicated drasha, then the original first premise would have been get paid for Torah study. Was ist schlecht? What's so terrible? You have a right, if you're employed by someone, to demand payment for it. And if you're teaching Torah, likewise, you have a right to demand payment for it. The only reason why you can't demand Torah money for Torah studies because of this yalfusa, this derivation. Holav hachi. The law would be you have a right to be paid. In fact, I'll prove it to you. The Rambam writes that for Torah Shebechsav you're allowed to be paid. It's only when we get to Torah Sheba'al Peh and we have this derivation, then all of a sudden, v'nahafachu, everything goes haywire, and you have to teach Torah without getting paid. But why don't you get paid for Torah study? The Rambam is revealing the secret of this drasha. And that is that the Talmud, or again, I'm going to use that term, I hope you're familiar with it, the Mislamed, has a right to demand that he be taught Torah free of charge, gratis. Because Moshe Rabbeinu was taught Torah by Hashem gratis, no payment to Hashem. The people of Israel were taught Torah gratis, no payment to Moshe. So it means when you're learning Torah, when you're being taught Torah, you have a right to say, I want to be taught Torah b'china, like Moshe was taught Torah b'chinam, and like Klal Yisrael were taught Torah b'chinam. As I state, that's what I think it says here in the Rambam. So that the root or the source where we anchor this halacha of b'chinam is in the Talmud. And I think if that be the case, there are tremendous ramifications here, because the Talmud is being given by the Torah a certain schus, a certain right. Like, for example, again, not to compare it, an ani, a poor person has a right to demand tzedakah. In fact, in Shulchan Aruch, the Gaon understands it that if he is not given tzedakah, then we go down to the field of the ani and of the ashir and we confiscate it. The ani is given bailus and schus tvia, a legal right to demand that money be forked over to him. And here, the Rambam is establishing that in Talmud Torah, the Mislamed is being granted a legal right to demand that Torah be taught to him. It only applies to Torah Sheba'al Peh. We'll have to figure out why. But be that as it may, going step by step, the Talmud is the schus tvia. He has a tvia to demand that someone teach him Torah Ba'al Peh. I'm sorry, Torah b'china. Oh, but wait a second. Very nice that you're demanding that I teach you Torah b'china. That's okay for a Zoom share once a week. But if I have to teach you Torah on a daily basis, is malacha my te'eleh? What am I going to do for parnasa? What am I going to give up my job? Do you have a right to demand that I teach you Torah gratis and starve to death? Again, I'm using that proverbially. So now we have a following scenario. I have a right to demand that Torah be taught to me. But guess what? There's no one in the city who's willing to teach me Torah b'chinam. Because every last chacham in the town in Ontario says, well, I'm not going to give up my job. I can't give up my job. So the Rambam addresses the following question. Yeah, it's very nice that the Talmud, the Mislamed, has rights to demand that he be taught Torah b'chinam. But guess what? There's no one there out there who's willing to play ball with him. No one is willing to teach him Torah b'chinam. So you know what happens? In such a case, we activate a principle called mechila. What is mechila? Mechila means that I have rights to forego my rights. You owe me 100, I could say I forego it. And the Rambam says we're going to force mechila down the throat of the Mislamed. Why? Because emes knei. The Rambam derives from the pasuk emes knei that the Talmud is obligated, whether he likes it or not, to give up his rights, forfeit his rights to be taught, to demand Torah b'chinam, and willing to pay for it. Rabbosa, if that be the case, our whole question that we started with falls by the wayside. It doesn't begin. It doesn't get off the ground. I was asking, how could the Melamed receive money for Torah study? He's not allowed to do so. Because if he does so, he's violating the principle of ma'ani b'chinam lamadati. and he's basically stealing from the Mislamed. So how is he going to teach Torah and get paid for it? The answer is that now we're facing a new situation, a brand new scenario, in which there's no one who's teaching him Torah. And now the pasuk says, Emes Knei, give up on your demands to be taught Torah gratis. And once you forego that, and you're obligated to do so, and you're mochel, memela, there's no issue, there's no problem for the Melamed to be paid. Because really, the Melamed should be paid. If not for the Alfusa. Mikra Adin, his rights to be paid are not inferior to the rights of the Mislami to demand to be taught Torah. Narvas, the Torah says that we're going to grant the Mislamic rights to demand that he be taught Torah. Okay, up to an extent. Those rights that are granted to the Mislamed will exist if there are people, Chachamim, let's say, people in the 70s, the 80s, they're sitting there waiting for someone to call on them to teach Torah, and they're living on retirement payments, or on kranot. How do you call that in English? I forget what it's called in English, but when you get, like, if you work for the public school system, you get like tons of money when you retire, whatever it is.
Pension,
excellent. Forgot the word pension. I owe you a pizza. Pension. Okay, so you're living on pensions. By teaching Torah, you lose nothing. But guess what? There's no one in the town who's on pension. We're all young guys. We're all working. So what do? In that case, the Gzeras HaKosuv of Ma'ani Lamadati Bechino, the Afatem Lamadatem Bechino, that you studied Torah and you'd have to pay for it, forget about that. The Torah granted you such a right, but in this scenario, you can't exercise that right because there's no one who's on pension in the town of Toronto.
And how are you learning Asr Lambda?
Again, Asr Lambda is before the Rambam gets to that very unique scenario. In other words, if, let's say, you're on pension, then you're not allowed to ask for money for teaching Torah. But let's say you're not on pension. You got a job. That's the safe of the Rambam. The Rambam wants to say, what do we do? How do we address the situation where the town is full of young people who are below retirement age? They're not living on pension. They don't want to give up their work and their salary in order to teach you Torah. So what do? The answer is, in that case, the whole Gzeres HaKosuv falls by the wayside. So again, in a situation where you are a scholar and you could teach so-and-so Torah, and you're on pension, and you don't have to give up your livelihood and your parnasa, your income, in order to teach him Torah, you teach him Bechinam. But why do you teach him Bechinam? That's the question. And the answer is because he has a right to demand that you teach him Bechinam. But if you're not on pension, my friend, and no one is in the town, now the Mislamed is desperate. He's really out there in the cold. He has no one to reach out to demand from him, that person, teach me Bechina, because no one's on pension. In that case, the Rambam says, the entire halacha falls by the wayside. Because the entire halacha Bechinam is a result of the fact that Lamadati Bechinam, which means that I was granted a right to demand that I be taught Bechinam. But if there's no one there to teach me Bechinam, then I have to forfeit that right. How do I know that? Because the pasuk says, Emes Knei. Ad kan Rabosai. Please think it over. I'm telling you, ich hab geschwitzt. I sweat this out. I didn't find it anywhere, but I think it's very meduyuk in the Rambam. But again, if you puncture my balloon, so be it. That's what Torah is.
Okay, shkoyach.
I'll end very quickly with a story my father used to tell. There was a town, and there was terrible economic situation in some shtetl back in Poland. There was one Yid who, Baruch Hashem, had money, but he wouldn't give any tzedakah. So all the institutions in that town came to beg him to give tzedakah. And he refused. That's what you call Yiddish a karga. He just couldn't get himself to give the money. Anyway, the man got very sick, this Gvir. He had a very high fever. And the doctor came to see him, and the doctor said, if you don't start sweating, then your fever is going to go through the ceiling and you're going to die. Anyway, his fever went up and up, and all the institutions came to see him. Maybe now he's on his deathbed. Maybe he would finally give away his money. The Talmud Torah came, and the mikvos, and the Hachnos Kala, all the anim came by. So finally, the man broke down. He realized he has a few minutes left to live. In our American language, his fever reached 105, 106. He's about to drop dead. And he starts giving away his money to this institution, and that institution. But then he yelled out, "Nein, nein, nein, ich schwitzt, ich schwitzt." I'm sweating. When he realized he's giving away all his money, he started breaking out in his sweat. It's all batal mutal. All right, gentlemen, have a great week.
Yeah,
And we'll see you. Hashem, the Geula should come.